Sometimes, a simple garage sale holds more than just forgotten trinkets. It carries a piece of history waiting to be rediscovered. But when one man picks up an old, battered war helmet, he has no idea the shocking story behind it, what happens when the truth comes to light. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The garage sale wasn't anything special, just an assortment of old furniture, mismatched dishware, and dusty boxes filled with things people had long forgotten about. Ryan Carter, 26, wasn't looking for anything in particular. He had just been passing through town on a weekend visit to see his grandfather, and when he spotted the handwritten "Yard Sale Today" sign propped up at the edge of a driveway, curiosity got the best of him. He strolled past stacks of paperbacks and vintage vinyl records, pausing here and there to thumb through a few items, but nothing really stood out. Then, in a worn-out cardboard box shoved under a fold-out table, something caught his eye. A dented, olive-green military helmet. Ryan reached in and lifted it out, brushing off a layer of dust. It was heavy, solid, with deep scratches running along the sides and a faded chin strap that still held together. The inside had remnants of an old leather liner, though most of it had deteriorated. Something about it felt real. Not like the replicas he'd seen in antique stores, but like it had actually been worn in battle. "How much for the helmet?" he asked the older woman running the sale. She glanced at it and shrugged. $5 sound fair? Ryan didn't think twice. He pulled out his wallet, handed her a $5 bill, and tucked the helmet under his arm. Later that afternoon, he brought it home, tossing it onto the kitchen table while grabbing a soda from the fridge. His grandfather, Walter Carter, was sitting nearby, flipping through an old newspaper. A retired mechanic and World War II veteran, Walter had always been quiet about his time in the war, speaking about it only in bits and pieces when asked. "Hey, Grandpa," Ryan said, taking a sip of his drink. "Check this out. Picked it up at a garage sale. Pretty cool, right?" Walter turned his head casually, but the moment his eyes landed on the helmet, he froze. His breath hitched, and the newspaper slipped from his fingers onto the floor. Ryan frowned. "Grandpa?" Walter slowly stood up, his chair scraping against the kitchen tiles. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he picked up the helmet. He turned it over, expecting it like a jeweler examining a rare diamond. His fingers traced the scratches, the faded initials near the brim and the dent on the side. His expression changed from confusion to something deeper, something Ryan had never seen before. A long, heavy silence filled the room. "Where did you get this?" Walter's voice was quiet but firm. Ryan blinked. Just a garage sale down the street. Some lady was selling it for $5. Why?" Walter didn't answer. He just kept staring at the helmet, his fingers gripping it tighter. Ryan had seen his grandfather emotional before, when his grandmother passed away, when an old war buddy sent him a letter, but this was different. This wasn't sadness, it was something else. Ryan leaned forward. "Grandpa, what is it?" Walter finally looked up, his eyes glassy, his lips pressed into a thin line. He swallowed hard, like he was forcing something back. Then, in a barely audible whisper, he said, "Because this was mine." Ryan felt a chill run through him. He had expected his grandfather to say something like, "Nice piece of history," or maybe tell him about how this style of helmet was used back in the war. Instead, Walter Carter stood there, gripping the helmet like it was a missing piece of himself. Ryan sat up straighter. Did he just say this was his? Wait. "What do you mean, this was mine?" Ryan asked carefully. Walter didn't respond right away. He turned the helmet in his hands, his fingers running along the scuffed metal like he was trying to confirm it was real. Then, slowly, he sank back into his chair, placing the helmet gently onto the table. "Where exactly did you find this?" Walter asked again, his voice low and serious. Ryan hesitated. Like I said, garage sale, maybe 3 blocks down. Some lady was selling a bunch of stuff. It was just sitting there in a box." Walter's gaze dropped to the initials faintly scratched near the brim. "W.C.," he muttered under his breath. Ryan leaned forward. "That's you, isn't it?" Walter exhaled, pressing his palm over the letters like they might vanish if he didn't hold them in place. "Yeah," he said, voice distant. "That's me." Ryan didn't know what to say. He looked between his grandfather and the helmet, trying to make sense of how something so personal could have ended up in some random sale. Walter reached inside the helmet, fingers brushing against the worn interior. "I lost this in France," he murmured. "Near the Rhine. 1945. Ryan swallowed. "And it just disappeared?" Walter nodded. "We were advancing through a bombed-out village. Artillery shells were falling everywhere. I remember an explosion. I got knocked off my feet. When I came to, my helmet was gone." He let out a breath, shaking his head. "Didn't think I'd ever see it again." Ryan was silent. He had always known his grandfather was a World War II veteran, but the man never spoke in detail about his experiences. Now the weight of what this helmet represented was starting to sink in. "Grandpa," Ryan said hesitantly, "how do you know it's really yours? I mean, after all these years?" Walter shot him a look, one that said, "You think I wouldn't recognize my own helmet?" But instead of answering immediately, he flipped the helmet over and tapped the inside lining. "There," he said. "Look closer." Ryan leaned in. At first, he didn't see anything. But then, hidden beneath the frayed edges of the liner, he spotted a faint engraving. "Waltzy 42nd Infantry." His grandfather's name, his unit. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. It was real. He looked up at his grandfather, who was staring at the helmet with an unreadable expression. "All these years," Walter murmured almost to himself. "All these years, and it turns up in a garage sale." He let out a bitter chuckle, but there was something else in his voice, something heavier. Ryan felt his stomach twist. "Grandpa, who sold this? Who had it all this time?" Walter's fingers curled around the helmet's brim. His jaw tightened. "I don't know," he said, but his tone carried an edge Ryan had never heard before. The air in the kitchen felt different now, charged, heavy with something Ryan couldn't quite name. He had thought this was just an old helmet, but watching his grandfather's reaction, he realized it was something else entirely. Something that wasn't supposed to come back. And for the first time since he had brought it home, Ryan felt uneasy. Ryan had never seen his grandfather rattled before. Walter Carter was the kind of man who carried himself with quiet confidence, the kind that came from a lifetime of knowing exactly who he was. He wasn't the type to be caught off guard. But now, staring at that helmet, he looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. Ryan shifted in his chair. "Grandpa, how did this get here?" Walter didn't answer right away. Instead, he ran a hand over his weathered face and exhaled. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't even know where to start." Ryan frowned. "Well, if you lost it in France, how the hell did it end up in some random garage sale 3 blocks away?" Walter shook his head. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." His fingers traced the initials again, as if confirming for the 100th time that they were real. Ryan thought back to the woman who had sold it to him. She hadn't seemed suspicious, just another person clearing out old belongings. "I could go back and ask," Ryan offered. "Maybe she knows where it came from." Walter's eyes flickered up to him. "No." His voice was sharp, firmer than Ryan expected. Ryan raised an eyebrow. "No?" His grandfather sighed and leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "If this thing has been missing for nearly 80 years, there's a reason, and I don't know if I'm ready for the answer." Ryan didn't know what to say to that. He had never thought much about his grandfather's past. Walter had always been Grandpa, the man who fixed old cars in his garage and cooked the best barbecue on the 4th of July. Sure, Ryan had heard stories here and there, but never anything too deep. Now, looking at the man in front of him, he realized there was an entire history buried behind those tired eyes. Ryan leaned forward. "What happened that day, Grandpa? The day you lost it?" Walter inhaled slowly. "It was late in the war, spring of 45. We were pushing through the last German-occupied villages near the Rhine." He turned the helmet in his hands as he spoke. "We thought we had them on the run. We were wrong. Ryan swallowed. He had seen enough war movies to know that phrase never meant anything good. We got ambushed, Walter continued, his voice quieter now. Shells hit the village, turned it to rubble. I got knocked out cold. When I woke up, my unit was gone, and so was my helmet. Ryan hesitated. Gone. You mean... Walter's eyes darkened. Killed. Captured. Scattered. I don't know. I was one of the lucky ones. Ryan felt the weight of those words. Either that I was sent to a new unit, never saw those men again. Never found my helmet. I figured it got buried in the wreckage, or some soldier picked it up and kept going. He exhaled, his fingers tightening around the brim. But I never thought it would show up here. A tense silence filled the kitchen. Ryan's mind raced. If his grandfather had left that helmet behind in the chaos of war, then someone had to have brought it back. Someone had kept it. And that meant someone new. Ryan licked his lips. Grandpa, you sure you don't want to go back to that garage sale, just to ask? Walter hesitated, then finally met Ryan's eyes. There was something unreadable in his expression. Tomorrow, he said. We'll go tomorrow. Ryan nodded, but the uneasy feeling in his stomach didn't go away, because something told him that helmet wasn't just an old relic. It was a message. The next morning, Ryan drove his grandfather down the quiet neighborhood street, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. He glanced over at Walter, who sat stiffly in the passenger seat, staring out the window but seeing something else entirely. The helmet rested on Walter's lap, like it belonged there. Ryan exhaled. You sure you want to do this, Grandpa? Walter nodded without looking at him. Yeah, it's been long enough. Ryan turned onto the street where the garage sale had been the day before. He half expected the tables and boxes to still be set up, but when they pulled up in front of the house, the driveway was empty. No signs of a sale, no people, just a quiet, unremarkable home. Ryan's stomach sank. Damn, looks like we missed them. Walter sat forward, studying the house. We're knocking anyway. Ryan hesitated. You think that's a good idea? Walter didn't answer. He was already opening the truck door, stepping out with the helmet still in his hands. Ryan sighed and followed. His grandfather had that same stubborn walk he always had when something was on his mind, like when the VA messed up his prescriptions, or when he argued with the mechanic over car parts. They stepped onto the porch, and Ryan knocked. They waited. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, after what felt like forever, the door creaked open. A middle-aged woman peered out, her eyes narrowing slightly when she saw them. Can I help you? Ryan cleared his throat. Hey, I was here yesterday. Bought a military helmet from your garage sale. Recognition flickered in her face, but it was brief. Right, the helmet. Did something happen? Walter stepped forward, holding it up. Where did you get this? The woman hesitated. She looked between Walter and the helmet, her lips pressing into a thin line. I'm not sure. We were just clearing out my father's storage. A lot of old stuff. Walter's grip on the helmet tightened. Your father, was he military? The woman exhaled, crossing her arms. Yeah. World War II. Passed away last year. Walter's face barely changed, but Ryan saw the way his shoulders tensed. What was his name? Walter asked. The woman hesitated again, this time longer. Howard Lasky. Walter's knuckles went white. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. Grandpa? Walter didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the woman, at the house, at something in the past that Ryan couldn't see. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Walter said, I knew him. The woman's face shifted. Confusion, then something close to concern. You knew my dad? Walter swallowed hard. We served together, he exhaled sharply, like something was clicking into place. But I thought he was killed in action. The woman blinked, shaking her head. "No, my dad came home. He never really talked about the war, but he made it back." Ryan saw the way his grandfather's fingers dug into the helmet's metal surface. This wasn't just some helmet. This was a door to something Walter had thought was buried long ago. Ryan cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I don't mean to be pushy, but do you know if your dad ever mentioned this helmet, or why he had it?" The woman's gaze flickered toward the object in Walter's hands. "No, but there are some old things in the attic. Maybe there's something up there that can tell you more." Walter finally looked up at her, his voice quiet but firm. "Show me." The woman hesitated for a moment, glancing back into the house before finally stepping aside. "Come in," she said, her voice softer now, uncertain. Ryan exchanged a glance with Walter, who gave a small nod before stepping over the threshold. The house smelled of old wood and something faintly floral, like air freshener trying to cover up the scent of time itself. The woman led them through the narrow hallway and up a creaky set of stairs. "Dad never let us go through his things," she admitted. "After he passed, I boxed up most of it without really looking. Figured I'd sell what I could and donate the rest." Walter didn't respond, but Ryan could see his jaw tighten. At the top of the stairs, the woman pulled a string, and a rickety attic door creaked open. A wooden ladder unfolded, revealing darkness above. She motioned toward it. "It's mostly junk, but if your helmet was in there, maybe there's something else." Walter didn't wait. He gripped the ladder and climbed with surprising speed for a man his age. Ryan followed closely behind. The attic was musty and dim, the only light coming from a small window covered in dust. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, some labeled with years written in fading black marker. Walter stepped forward and scanned the room, his hands clenched into fists. "This is all his stuff?" Walter asked, his voice oddly distant. The woman, still standing at the attic entrance, nodded. "Everything Dad kept from his time in the service should be in those boxes." Ryan moved toward one marked war trunk and carefully lifted the lid. Inside were old uniforms, yellowed letters, and a stack of photographs. He pulled one out and brushed off the dust. The black and white image showed a group of young soldiers, their faces full of exhaustion and determination. Walter's breath hitched. He stepped closer, snatching the photo from Ryan's hands. His eyes darted across the image until they landed on one man, standing slightly off to the side. Howard Lasky. Ryan could tell by the way Walter's hand trembled that he had no doubt. The woman peered over their shoulders. "That's my dad," she murmured. "You're in this picture too." Walter swallowed hard. "Yeah." Ryan's mind raced. "Grandpa, what happened between you two?" Walter exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around the photo. "Lasky was in my unit. Last time I saw him was during the ambush, the same one where I lost my helmet." Ryan frowned. "So, how did he end up with it?" Walter didn't answer. Instead, he reached into the box, pulling out another photograph, this one showing a different scene, a battered village, soldiers walking through the rubble. A handwritten note on the back made Walter's face go pale. "Survivors of the 42nd Infantry, March 19, 945. We made it. Lasky." Ryan's pulse quickened. "Grandpa?" Walter slowly turned the photograph over, staring at the faces. "I thought they were all gone," he murmured. "I thought I was the only one who made it out." Ryan felt a chill. Howard Lasky hadn't just taken Walter's helmet. He had lived, and now, all these years later, the truth was finally catching up. Walter stared at the photo in his hands, his fingers gripping the edges as if letting go would make it disappear. The faces in the image were familiar, yet distant, like ghosts frozen in time. The village in the background, reduced to rubble, was exactly as he remembered it. Ryan watched his grandfather closely. "You okay, Grandpa?" Walter swallowed. His voice came out rough. "I don't know." The woman leaned against a nearby box, her arms crossed as she studied the photograph. "I don't understand," she admitted. "Dad never talked about the war, but if he survived that ambush, Why wouldn't he have said anything? Walter exhaled, shaking his head. Because not everyone who survives comes back the same. Ryan felt a chill at those words. He had always known his grandfather was tough, but there was something different in his tone now, something heavier. Walter flipped through the rest of the stack, stopping on another picture. It was taken at night, the lighting dim. Several men were huddled together, and in the center someone was wearing a familiar helmet. Walter's helmet. Ryan pointed at it. "That's you." Walter nodded. "Yeah." The back of the photo had another note, scribbled in faded ink. "To whoever finds this, I'm sorry. Hell." The woman gasped softly. "That's my dad's handwriting." Walter set the photo down carefully, his hands noticeably shaking. "Lasky must have picked it up after I got hit. But why keep it? Why hold on to it all these years?" Ryan considered that for a moment. Maybe he felt guilty, maybe he thought you were dead, and it was his way of carrying something of yours forward. Walter was silent for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice distant. "We were in the same unit, but we weren't always on the same side of things. Lasky had a reputation. He was a good soldier, but he wasn't afraid to make tough calls." He clenched his jaw, the kind of calls that get men killed. The woman looked between them, clearly struggling to piece it together. "You're saying my dad did something?" Walter exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. "I don't know, but if he kept this helmet, if he wrote that note, then there's something I don't remember. Something he never told anyone." Ryan felt his pulse quicken. "So, what now?" Walter's eyes flickered toward the boxes. "We keep looking." Ryan helped sift through the piles of old documents, faded maps, and worn-out field notes. Then, buried beneath a tattered military jacket, Walter pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. The initials on the cover made Ryan's breath catch. "Hello." Walter's fingers hovered over the worn pages before finally flipping it open. The handwriting was cramped, hurried, like someone writing in the middle of a war zone. The first few pages were routine entries, dates, locations, names of soldiers. Then, about halfway through, Walter froze. Ryan leaned in. "What is it?" Walter swallowed hard, reading aloud. "March 1945. The ambush was worse than expected. Carter didn't make it. I couldn't stay. I took what I could and ran. I'll live with this forever." A heavy silence filled the attic. Ryan's stomach tightened. "He thought you were dead." Walter clenched his jaw, his knuckles white against the pages. "He left me." The woman covered her mouth, her eyes wide. "My dad." Walter closed the notebook and exhaled sharply. He carried this secret for decades. Ryan stared at him. "And now, after all this time, it found its way back to you." Walter let out a slow, heavy breath. "Yeah," he muttered. "It did." Walter sat still, his fingers locked around the notebook like it was the last piece of a puzzle he never wanted to solve. The attic was quiet now, the dust-heavy air pressing in on all of them. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. He had never seen his grandfather look like this before, like a man standing at the edge of something too deep to climb out of. "So he left you behind," Ryan said slowly, trying to process the weight of the words. Walter's jaw clenched. "Yeah." The woman, Howard Lasky's daughter, wrapped her arms around herself. "I don't understand," she murmured. "My dad never talked about his time in the war. I just assumed it was because he didn't want to relive it. But this—" She shook her head. "He thought you were dead?" Walter exhaled through his nose, staring at the note in front of him. "That's what it looks like." Ryan frowned, glancing at the scrawled handwriting. But why did he run? If he thought you were dead, why not report it? Why keep your helmet? Walter didn't answer right away. His fingers tightened around the edge of the notebook, his knuckles pale. "Fear," he muttered, "or guilt." The woman hesitated. "My dad, wasn't a coward. Walter's eyes flickered toward her, his expression unreadable. "No," he said carefully, "but he was a survivor." Ryan could feel the weight of that statement. Walter finally exhaled and turned another page in the notebook. More scribbled notes, days spent moving from town to town, mentions of names, some familiar, some not. Then, near the back, Walter's face darkened. "I should have gone back, I should have made sure. But I told myself it was too late, it was easier that way." The attic felt smaller suddenly, as if the air had been sucked out of it. Ryan swallowed. He regretted it. Walter didn't move, just kept staring at the words, like they were a wound he had never expected to reopen. The woman's voice wavered. "He never told anyone." Walter finally looked up at her. "Because some ghosts don't let you go." Silence stretched between them, thick and unspoken. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. "So, what do we do now?" Walter glanced at the helmet resting beside him, its metal still dented from whatever hell had taken it from him all those years ago. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he let out a slow breath and nodded. "We make sure the truth isn't forgotten." The woman blinked. "You mean—" Walter closed the notebook, tapping his fingers against the cover. "We tell the story. Not just mine, his too." Ryan exhaled. "You sure you want to?" Walter gave a small, tired smile, the kind that carried too many years of silence. "It's time." The woman hesitated, then finally nodded. And with that the past, long buried, long hidden, was finally coming home. Walter sat in the attic for a long moment, the weight of the notebook pressing into his palms. It wasn't just paper and ink. It was a window into a past that had been locked away for decades. He had spent his entire life believing he had been abandoned, left for dead. Now, in the dim glow of an old attic light bulb, he realized that Howard Lasky had carried that day with him just as much as Walter had. Ryan leaned against the dusty wooden beam, arms crossed. "So, what do we do now?" Walter let out a slow breath, his fingers brushing against the worn pages. "We start by reading every word in this book." Lasky's daughter, still hugging her arms, hesitated before kneeling beside Walter. "I need to know, too." Walter gave a slow nod. He flipped another page, scanning through scribbled notes and hurried thoughts. "Survived the ambush. Carter didn't. I should have checked, but the artillery was too close. No time. Had to keep moving." Walter's jaw tightened. "I told myself he was gone, but when I found his helmet later, I knew I should have looked. I knew." The room was silent, except for the creak of the attic beams settling under the weight of time itself. Ryan glanced at his grandfather, watching the tension in his shoulders. He blamed himself. Walter nodded slowly. Yeah, he did. They kept reading, flipping through notes detailing Lasky's movements after the attack. He had taken Walter's helmet not as a trophy, but as a reminder, one he had never been able to let go of. "I made it home, but I left part of myself in that village. I left him there." Lasky's daughter wiped her eyes. "I had no idea." Walter closed the notebook gently, staring down at it. "Neither did I." Ryan hesitated. "You always thought he left you to die, right?" Walter nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, and maybe he did." He ran a hand over the notebook's cover. But he never stopped carrying it with him. A long silence settled between them. Finally, Ryan cleared his throat. "So what happens now? We just let this sit here?" Walter shook his head. No. He looked up at Lasky's daughter. "Your father kept this secret his whole life, but you deserve to know the truth, and I think it's time I tell my part too." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "You're going to talk about it?" Walter exhaled. "I spent too many years keeping my own ghosts locked up. Maybe it's time I let them breathe." Lasky's daughter gave him a small, grateful nod. For the first time since Ryan had pulled that helmet out of the garage sale box, Walter looked lighter, as if some invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The past had finally come full circle, and now it was time to set it free. The ride back home was quiet. Walter sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, his hand resting on the helmet in his lap. Ryan could feel the heaviness in the air, but didn't know what to say. He had spent his whole life looking up to his grandfather, admiring the way he carried himself, strong, unwavering. But today, he had seen something different. Something raw, something human. Ryan cleared his throat as he turned onto their street. So, what now? Walter didn't answer immediately. He traced the rim of the helmet with his fingers before finally speaking. I think I need to tell my story. Ryan nodded. Yeah, I think you do. Walter exhaled through his nose, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I never thought I'd see this thing again. Never thought I'd have to face that part of my life. He shook his head. Turns out the past doesn't stay buried just because you ignore it. Ryan pulled into the driveway and killed the engine. Are you okay? Walter gave a quiet chuckle. I don't know, but for the first time in a long time, I think I'm ready to be. Ryan let that sit between them for a moment before nodding. They stepped out of the truck, walking toward the house as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the lawn. Ryan could feel the shift in his grandfather's posture. He wasn't carrying the weight the same way anymore. Inside, Walter placed the helmet on the dining table, sitting down across from it like an old friend. Ryan took a seat next to him, waiting. After a long silence, Walter finally spoke. You know, back then, we didn't talk about fear, about guilt. We were soldiers, and soldiers didn't have the luxury of looking back. He tapped his fingers against the table. I spent decades thinking Lasky left me because he wanted to, because he was scared. But maybe he just couldn't live with what happened. Ryan listened, letting his grandfather's words settle. Walter leaned back in his chair, exhaling. It's strange. I hated that man for years. Hated him for what I thought he did, and now... His eyes flickered to the helmet. Now I feel sorry for him. Ryan frowned. Sorry? Walter nodded. He carried this with him for the rest of his life. He couldn't tell anyone, couldn't let it go. Maybe he tried to forget, but this helmet, this notebook, he kept them. He lived with the ghosts just like I did. Ryan swallowed. So, what do we do with it? Walter considered that for a long moment before answering. We honor it. Ryan raised an eyebrow. How? Walter's gaze didn't waver. We tell the truth. Lasky deserves that much. And maybe, just maybe, I do too. Ryan let out a slow breath, nodding. The helmet wasn't just a relic anymore. It was a story, a confession, a piece of history finally coming to light. And after all these years, it was finally time to be heard. The next morning, Walter sat at the kitchen table, the helmet in front of him like an old friend waiting for a conversation that had been delayed for far too long. Ryan poured 2 cups of coffee and placed one in front of his grandfather before sitting down. The silence between them wasn't tense anymore. It was filled with understanding. Walter exhaled. I never thought I'd see this thing again. Never thought I'd have to deal with it. Ryan nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. You don't have to, you know. If you want to just put it away, leave it alone. No. Walter cut him off gently, shaking his head. It's been left alone for too long. I think I owe it to myself, to Lasky, to do something with it. Ryan studied him for a moment. His grandfather looked different, lighter somehow, as if carrying this burden for so long had weighed him down more than he had ever let on. What are you thinking? Ryan asked. Walter ran his fingers over the helmet's dented surface. I want to go back. Ryan blinked. Back where? Walter met his eyes. France. Back to where it all happened. Ryan hadn't expected that. Are you serious? Walter gave a small nod. I spent decades pretending that part of my life didn't exist, that what happened there didn't shape me, but it did. He sighed. And if I don't go back, I'll never really lay it to rest. Ryan leaned back in his chair, letting the idea settle. "Okay," he finally said. "Then I'm coming with you." Walters smirked. "Didn't think I'd let you stay behind, did you?" Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess not." For the first time in a long time, Walter felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had spent too many years wondering what happened in that village, wondering if he had been forgotten, if his survival had meant anything. Now he had his answer. Lasky hadn't forgotten, and now neither would Walter. They spent the next few weeks planning, reaching out to historical organizations that helped veterans return to the battlefields they once fought on. The process was slow, but with each step forward, Walter felt something inside him shift. When the day finally came, Walter and Ryan stood at the edge of a quiet field in France, looking over what had once been a war-torn village. It was peaceful now, the ruins overgrown with grass, the echoes of war faded into history. Walter took a deep breath and knelt down, placing the helmet in the soil. "This is where it belongs," he murmured. Ryan watched, understanding the moment for what it was, a closing of a chapter, a return to something left unfinished. Walter stood up, brushing the dirt off his hands. He looked at Ryan with a smile that carried decades of unspoken pain, and the relief of finally letting it go. "Time to go home," he said. Ryan nodded. "Yeah, Grandpa, let's go home." As they walked away, the helmet remained where it was, resting beneath the sky, no longer lost, finally at peace.